This Carr Mercury came in, and the tag just says, just a checkup. Now, normally, I'd be inclined to call the owner immediately and see if there's any specific reason that it's in for a checkup. And I will call them once I've gone through it. I don't call them immediately because I don't want to call and say, can you be more specific if there's an obvious buzz. I don't want their first impression of my work to be that I missed something obvious. So I'm going to rule out anything obvious. But before I do anything else, I'm just making sure all the hardware is tight that holds the baffle in place and the handle up here. Those things work loose a lot. Handles seem never to be fully tight on amps that come in. And baffles, by their nature, wood contracts and shrinks and expands with humidity and temperature, and everything vibrates. So these things can come loose. I'm not using a power tool for this. I don't want to over torque it and risk breaking anything. I'm just going to get as tight by hand as possible. Now, sometimes there'll be a caps nut or a tooth washer on the rear, so I'll have to give it some rear support to do that. But these seem to be tightening up just fine, just from the front. And while I'm not over torquing them, in all modesty, I'm pretty strong and I can get these things really, really tight. All right, let me flip this around and we'll take it out of the cabinet. Let's look at its construction. All right, so they've got a single-ended amp here, and they've got this little Art Deco port here. I'll let you see the tube while still protecting it. That's pretty. That kind of stuff would make my one-off amps a little more expensive, but it's the kind of thing that once you're set up for production, you can do fairly inexpensively. Just little touches like that. Things that I would like to do, just economics of scale precludes that a lot of the time. Now I'm looking at this and I've got to remove these 6 screws here to pull the rear panel out. These are what are holding the chassis in place, and the chassis is held to this rear panel with these 6 screws. So before I do that, I need to feel around in here. All right, there's not an IEC. This is hardwired, so it's best that I unscrew this holder. Can you see this? Yeah, for this power cable first. Got a nice medical grade, hospital grade power cable on there. Good on them. I gotta get that while reaching it. Let's see if I can get it in there with this screwdriver, or whether I need to get to one of the shorter ones. Okay, good, no problem. I also need to feel around inside and see how the speaker is connected, because I don't want to tug on any wires or connections and strain anything when I pull that chassis. Put this screw and washer to the side, and feel around inside for a speaker connection. There's a reverb connection there. I can feel that. All right, here's the speaker connection. So that's disconnected. Now let's see if I can get a handle on the reverb. Never had one of these models in before, and this stuff is fun. All right, there's one. So gray seems to be the first one I felt. And then gray and gray. So I want to ding Carr a little bit for that. Gray and gray is relatively useless. So I will test this on the bench before putting it back in place, and I'll probably put a little black dot on one of them so that the orientation is a little bit less hard to guess. All right, so it's got an eminence black and blue in there, sorry, red, white, and blue. Time to pull all of this, and we pause this and do that, and then we'll look at the insides. All right, let's open these up. Now, I've warned against mismatching screws before. That number 2 bit is a little too small for that. So let me get out my number 3 to start them. All the resistance is going to be when you first loosen them or when you first tighten them. Huh, it's not a number 3. Well, since my power bit is a little bit loose, that feels good. I'm starting by hand. Just when you first undo them or at the last bit of tightening, that's where you can strip things if there's any resistance. Or if it's a wood screw where there's resistance the whole time. These are going to be machine screws, and at this point they should come out very easily. In fact, I can do the faster speed on these. All right, let's see what's inside this bad boy. Aha, or not. Here we go. Well, it is definitely a Carr. The Smurfs get very excited inside these things. Now, if you're wondering what these things are that you're seeing, these are great big Solon film caps. They use these instead of electrolytics. They're very expensive and they only come in certain values, but if you have the space and the budget, they're a great thing because these film caps don't age and wear out like electrolytics do. So these are very unlikely to ever need to be changing, but they are an expensive proposition. He's got very nice shielded wires here and there. This is point to point, which makes service much more expensive, but he's using very good quality components. Hopefully this amp won't need any real service. I'm going to make sure everything's tight and that all the jacks and pots are clean. Those are mechanical things, switches, input jacks, pots. These have mechanical forces upon them and can wear out no matter how expensive and well built the amp is. Let's take a look at some things here. It's got a pot down here and a subsection, a little box built out here, I guess just so you can reach it easily on the back. I don't know what that does yet. I don't have a schematic for this amp. I doubt they'll give me one, but I can suss it out. All right, so tube-wise, got a JJ, then a Electro-Harmonix AT7 that's going to be reverb, then a groove tubes. So it's going to have 2 tube gain stages, an AT7 paralleled for a send, and then it's got a reverb mixed in. I imagine this is, yeah, so 2 gain stages, reverb send, reverb mixer, and then the driver, in this case of a EL34 single-ended output tube. And the controls on the front are output wattage, reverb level, turn that down, bass treble, tone defeat boost, 3-position switch, and then volume. So that's just going to be bypassing the tone stack by varying degrees and changing a capacitor that takes the place of the tone stack for different levels of boost and different amounts of mids. Has a on, off power switch. So he's doing a polarity thing, looks like, which is stupid, in my opinion, given that you have a grounded power cable. But people love their vintage polarity switch. That would be of use if you have a venue or house where you don't have a grounded power, and then you can have the old thing there, but that means that you're at risk of electrocuting yourself, and it's much better to design an amp to say, hey, Use this with modern electrical codes only. So I disagree with that, but it shouldn't be crippling. And then a standby switch with a cap across it. All right, let me hook up a speaker and see what it sounds like. And just because it did say in for a checkup, which means there could be something wrong with the amp, I will power this up initially with my current limiter in place. Keeps us from blowing fuses or having anything release the magic smoke. I move the camera so you can see what I'm seeing. Tripods and cables are fun to balance things out with. All right, let's power it on. I randomly chose the down position when powering it on. Actually, before I do that, let me double check the fuse that's in here. It's a 1 amp fuse. That makes sense for a single-ended amp, even with a 34. All right, let's power it back on. And now we're going to stand by. Yeah. And let's measure what the voltage at the output of this. Let me turn it off actually and let it chill for a second. That's what the voltage is at the node that gets switched by standby to see if this amp actually needs standby. I would think that it would not. These are 500 volt caps. All right, I got 30 volts and declining as the caps drain from me powering it off. Power it back on. So it's 449 volts. So well underneath the 500 volts. This amp does not need standby. I'll go ahead and turn it up. The standby is pretty much vintage appeasement in this amp. A way to give it basically a mute switch. Always got 500 volts DC on the switch. That switch is never rated for DC use. So, you know, it works for a long time till it doesn't. So, there's a failure mode there built in. Plug the guitar in. Let's put it at 10 o'clock on the volume and see what it sounds like. Single EL34 should be about a 12 watt amp, I guess. Maybe less than that. Gotta say, for a single-ended amp, this thing is very quiet as far as hum and noise goes. So that kudos to them on that. I don't know whether they did the trick of having one filter node, and then a choke or resistor network on both sides, then the main node. One of the ways to reduce noise with a single-ended amp, but it sounds pretty good. Given that they have bias test point measurements, I assume it's fixed bias. Which would make sense given that trim pot on the back. So I'll be checking the bias So far all the pots seem good. I don't have the reverb connected, so this is going to be a little bit noisy as I turn it up. I just want to make sure the pot doesn't have any noise in it. Not too bad in terms of adding hiss. There's no issue with that pot mechanically. So let's see how the tone stack bypass stuff does. I think I prefer an unbypassed and then position 1. I think position 2 is a little too much. But people will disagree with that. I think I just prefer the first two, but that's why there's so many different flavors of ice cream. Now let's check out the power attenuation stuff. Alright, that seems to be doing that just through some resistive networks. And you can do that with a very low wattage amp like this. I don't think it's the best way to do it these days, but it does work. These things do generate some heat, and it's a complicated wiring setup, but it seems to be working fine. There's a cut switch here. Let's see what it does. Alright, so it's working like a box cut circuit, just fixed versus adjustable. So let's see what the revisit the clean sounds with that in the brighter set mode are. Yeah, with the cut switch up, so it's not cutting any highs, then position 3 becomes much better to me. Telecaster, Carr Mercury. Messed it up. So that's fun. Sorry, I left my phase pedal at home. Unless there's a problem with the reverb or the speaker, which I will check, I'm not seeing any issue with this amp. Let me pause this and get set up to measure the bias and see where we're at with that. There's the ways they tell you online and owner's manuals and stuff. I don't do that, but the way I do it is very dangerous. I'm not going to put that in a YouTube video in case someone were to copy me poorly and kill themselves. So be right back with some bias information. Well, according to my measurements, this thing is biased with 120 volt mains straight at 49.7% idle, which for essentially a glorified champ is pretty much ideal. It sounds good, you can have long tube life. This 34 is ever so slightly microphonic, which may be an issue in that cabinet. I'll call the owner and see if he wants me to do anything. You know, in general, I would want a better set of tubes in here for an amp this nice. JJs are fine. How do you call it? Groove tube labeled thing is probably a JJ or a Sovtech. The Electro-Harmonix 12AT7 is not the best. I think there are better sounding 34s than the JJ, but the amp is working just fine. I don't see a problem with any of it. I will test the reverb in the speaker, but this amp with its 10 to 12 watt output should never stress out that 65 watt or whatever it is impedance. I'll check out the reverb. Let's see what the current measurement I get here from this bias test point is, which is going to include the screen current. I was measuring the actual plate current. This says 34 millivolts, which is the same thing. Should be the same thing. Let me see what resistor they got there. Yeah, they got a 1 ohm, so that should be the same thing as 34 milliamps of current. And I am saying that it is actually drawing 30.5 milliamps of plate current. The additional 3.5 milliamps of current that I'm measuring here are actually through the screen resistor, which is a 1K, which is it's a very nice quality 6.5 watt Vishay Dale. It's pretty much the same stuff in this amp that I use in my own. I use Vishay yellow caps instead of the Mallory 150s, but a lot of the resistors in here are the same things I use. A lot of good choices in here. I am not a fan of all the goop that he puts in his amps. And, Smurf jokes aside, when this amp eventually needs service, this silicone makes it more difficult to service things, and it really isn't necessary in 90% of the places he's got it here. Makes for a very stable amp, and using a lot of solid core wire like this, the more you can stabilize that, the better in terms of microphonics, because stiff wire can have acoustic properties. I think this is just a little bit over the top. That said, in this particular amp's case, I think it's a moot point. I don't think this amp needs anything. Possibly a fresh set of tubes just to sound even better. None of the pots are loose, none of the jacks are loose, none of the pots are dirty. Aside from us kind of getting a tour of this amp on this video, it's almost been a waste of the owner's time and money, though I haven't touched it with a soldering iron, so the repair bill is going to be my bare minimum. Bare minimum. But let me call him and let him know what I have found and see if there's any behavior that he's reporting. Maybe after the amp's been on 3 hours, it begins to do something, in which case I can look for that. But as it is, I think it might have just been an abundance of caution on his part, which I applaud. When you have an amp this nice, and that's, or just let's say that costs as much as the Carr Mercury costs, because nice is subjective, cost is pretty objective for most of us. It's good to protect your investment. So let me call him and see if he wants any further tweaking, or just wanted to know that things are as they should be, in which case I can tell him that right now they seem to be. Well, I spoke to the owner, very nice guy. He is going through his amp collection, just making sure everything is good. He's got a lot of heavy amps that he's going to be bringing me next, but this is the one which is the lightest amp he owns. He wants to get a lot of use out of it. It was sitting unused for several years. He wanted to make sure it was safe, and it's a very, very good thing for him to do that. This amp is fairly unique in that the majority of the filter caps are, as you see, these giant film caps that don't dry out and wear out the same way in terms of the dielectric that an electrolytic capacitor does. But it does have some electrolytics in here. But if this amp had been sitting in storage for 10 years with electrolytics, you'd want to bring these up very slowly on a variac. But this thing's, aside from some hours on these tubes, this amp is essentially brand new still. And so I'm going to button it up, and because I haven't even done the soldering iron, touched it, I've just taken some measurements and made sure the bias was right, and we got this groovy little video out of it. I'm going to waive my bench fee and give him a very minimal charge for this. But kind of as a reward to him for doing the right thing by his amp and getting it checked out after a few years of non-use. So kudos to him, and let him lead by example.